It's been a great summer around here. Lots to celebrate. A lot of one at a time stories. Just to say to God, thank you. And in a world where we are often, I think, overwhelmed by numbers and statistics, certainly these days by polls and posts, as a church, we are passionate about having the heart of Jesus for one person at a time. We just want to keep it simple the way that Jesus kept it simple. So when you're studying through the Gospels, you'll find places where there are some numbers mentioned. There are moments where the Gospel writers say, hey, here's how many people were here when Jesus was teaching, or here's how many people were fed when Jesus worked this miracle. But for the most part, when you're reading through the Gospels, the focus is on one life at a time, one person at a time who encounters Jesus, and everything changes for them. And so we want that to be our heartbeat as a church. We want that to be what we celebrate and what we're committed to. And so look, I'm thrilled about thousands of students going to camp, but it's because of the one at a time stories. People like Grant, junior in high school, told God before camp started, God, this is your last chance. And maybe that's not the theologically correct prayer to pray, but that's how he was feeling. And he was discouraged, and he was just doubting his faith. His parents had gone through a difficult divorce, and he just wasn't sure he believed anymore, but he went to camp, and he experienced the power and presence of God in a way that he never had before. And so this past week, school starts, and Grant and some of his buddies start a student-led Bible study for school. I love those one-at-a-time stories. I don't know if you got to be at one of our campuses last weekend where it was student takeover weekend. And at most of our campuses, the students gathered around the front to worship. And in doing so, I think they just led a lot of us in worship, and I loved it. I know, like me, most of you, if you saw that, if you experienced that, it just filled your heart with joy, just inspired you. I know not all of you are like that. Like there are some of you, not a lot, but there's some of you who thought, and some of you who said, hey, they should go back to their seats. Those students need to tone it down. No, we love it, and we want more of it, for sure, right? And you're not gonna tone down this next generation. You're not gonna silence this next generation. I'm just telling you, there's a fire burning and there's a wind blowing in that generation, and we as a church are here for it. I love one-at-a-time stories like Grant. I think of Mark this past summer. Mark got connected to our church through one of the addiction recovery centers that we get to serve. And he grew up going to church, but there was lots of guilt and shame associated with church in Mark's heart and life. But we're going through Romans 8, and he starts hearing about the love of God and that nothing will separate you from the love of God. Nothing will change how much he loves you. And you couldn't do anything to make him love you more, and you can't do anything to make him love you less. And Mark heard that, and he believed it. And so he was one of the 800 plus people who were baptized at Southeast this summer, and you didn't know his story, but you celebrated with him. When he came up out of that water, you celebrated the freedom and the forgiveness that he found in Jesus. I love it. I love one-at-a-time stories like Susan. I mean, as much as I loved seeing the fact that there were like 32,000 people in person across the campuses this summer, it's really the one-at-a-time Susan stories where her neighbor invited her to church. Susan's a widow, lost her husband a few years ago. The neighbor didn't know that Susan had been dealing with this isolation and loneliness, and that she had had thoughts of taking her own life. But the neighbor invited Susan to church, and she reluctantly came, even though she hadn't been to church since she was a little girl. And when she came to church on that first weekend of At the Movies, she believed it. Like she believed that God loved her, and that God saw her, and that God wasn't done with her. And she's not missed a week since. And she joined a group that starts this week, and she is getting connected to the more than 900 widows that are part of our church family. I love to hear stories like Susan's. I think of one-at-a-time stories. Like my friend Charles and his sweet wife, SB. Charles is one of our pastors. My heart breaks for them, and their son was a senior in high school, died last month in a tragic accident. And as I embraced Charles and we wept together, there was a lot I didn't know, but one thing I knew is that we, as a church, would love him. I knew that they were going to go through a valley, but they weren't going to go through the valley alone, and that there was hope in the midst of it. That's what it means to be a part of a church.